Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new or part of the large percentage of people who are still not subscribed to this YouTube channel, make sure that you do that so that these videos will show right up in your feed, and also make sure to like the video if you're enjoying all the content. Now, the physical trapper, meaning Seismic and Exsanguinate Trapper, is probably one of the more popular builds going into this league, and I feel that for softcore specifically, this is one of the most powerful builds going into the league as well. This build can do every single piece of content of the game that we know so far. We don't exactly know what's going to be going on with a lot of the Uber stuff and the very high level stuff, so I can't guarantee those, but everything that we know already I have done myself with this build without spending a ton of money on it. There are a lot of people suggesting this build, so I've tried to account for potentially the cost of some of the items like Cold Iron Point early on in the league, and I've done my best to make the path of building as up to date as possible. Now 3.16 is bringing one of the largest changes to the passive skill tree that we have ever seen, and with this there are going to be some growing pains. So the path of building that I have provided is going to be a living path of building. It means that it's going to change over time as we figure out more about the league. The dodge keystones have been essentially removed now, and we are forced to use more of an evasion type defensive. Originally I was going to try to do like an hybrid ES evasion, EBMOM kind of build, but that didn't end up panning out, so we went with the straight spell dodge, evasion, and blind scaling set of defensive layers, which I think should be pretty strong going into the next league. Now this build does have pretty much everything that you could want. It has absolutely ridiculous boss damage and worthwhile clear. The build does not move as fast as some other builds out there, but it's really hard to get a trapper build moving quickly nowadays. However, the clear is excellent, the recovery layers are excellent, defensive should be quite good going into the next patch, and this build absolutely excels at bossing. So if you're looking for a build that can do some early bossing, maybe you want to farm up some of those awakened gems from Cirrus, or you're interested in doing some of the new Uber content, this build should be excellent for that. Now, jumping into the path of building, there are a few things that we need to talk about. There are a couple different versions of this build that are in here. I will go through those in a moment, but first I want to talk about how you will actually begin with this character. So early on, you're going to level with traps. They have changed the initial skill tree here to be a little bit different, and it's kind of harder, I would say, to scale hybrid trap and mine damage. Previously, I would have done Stormblast Mine all the way up to 28, where you can swap over to Exsanguinate as well as Seismic Trap, but after they've changed the initial nodes here, it's going to be a little bit harder. So the new leveling is going to use Stormblast Mine up until 12, you will swap over to Lightning Trap and use that until 28. Now, one thing that is very important about the early leveling is that when you do swap over to Seismic Trap, you're going to need two very important things. The first one is going to be this Trap Mastery that gives you recover 30 life when your trap is triggered by an enemy. This is very powerful early on, but it will lose effectiveness later on in the game. The other thing that you're going to want is the Pyromaniac Ascendant Point. This is very important. Recovering 10% of your life and recovering 30 every time that your trap procs is going to be the way that you maintain your life, because the way that this build works is that we spend life for the majority of our attacks for pretty much the entire game, all the way up until the very end, where we swap our Seismic Trap and other abilities besides Exsanguinate over to our Energy Shield with EB, Eldritch Battery. And then after you're able to swap into Exsanguinate and Seismic Trap, it will be smooth sailing all the way through the campaign, all the way into the end game, and you pretty much don't have to change very much at all. Now, as I said previously, it will show you the ascendancy points that you're supposed to take in order. If you do go through here, you'll see that the ascendant points go in order of Pyromaniac, Perfect Crime, Chain Reaction, and Born in the Shadows. Now, these trees are going to be a guideline for where you should be moving around. We're grabbing some things like resistances and such early on, but you will need to do a respec at a certain point. So once you've reached this point in the tree, you might notice that we're going out two separate ways. Well, unfortunately, early in the game, as I said, they've removed those trap and mine nodes from here, and we're kind of forced to get either evasion and energy shield, which isn't too useful for us early on, or elemental damage. So we decide to go with the elemental damage. And what we're going to do later is we're going to connect these trees, and when we respec, we will remove most of these points going up towards the top and move all the way over here to the right side as well as the middle of the tree. This is going to give us a lot more room to scale evasion as well as life and trap duration or skill effect duration, which is very important for the early damage of Seismic Trap. Now, moving on to the end game tree, there are going to be multiple different versions of the end game, and what I want you to know is that initially I feel that the physical tree is going to be the one that you would want to go. Crit scaling is still going to be very important for this build no matter what you are doing, but in the early physical version of the tree, this is the one that is going to be like when you have essentially no gear, if you're trying to play solo self-found, or if you are very early on in the league. I am assuming that Cold Iron points are going to be expensive because of how popular this build is going to be. So what I've done is that in the items you'll see here in the budget version, there is going to be just simple +1 Fizz Wands. These are very easy to craft. craft. There's notes on how to craft those in the actual like section down at the bottom, but these items are not difficult to make. On top of that, if cold iron points do end up being extremely expensive, I have put a separate cold version of the build in here. This is going to be scaling brittle. The way that brittle works is that it is an alternative ailment instead of chill and freeze, and we are going to be getting this through the Gale Sight helmet. Now, I have no idea how expensive this is going to be early on in the league. It very much so depends on how many people end up playing the cold conversion version of this. We will be using Gale Sight as well as Hrim Sorrow to convert 50% of our fizz to cold, and then we will also be using the Cold Mastery here to gain an additional 40% of physical damage converted to cold. On top of that, another very important node for when we are going brittle scaling is going to be this Critical Mastery that gives 50% increased effect of non-damaging ailments you inflict with critical strikes. Because the way that brittle works, and if you are swapping over to the brittle version of this build, you will need to do a few things. You'll have to swap over to the cold Seismic Trap conversion, the cold auras, and in configuration, you will have to set the effect of brittle. Now, depending on how much damage you're doing, the effect of brittle will go anywhere from about 5 to 15. I would assume that if you are playing the build properly and gearing properly, as well as having this critical strike mastery, you should be able to hit 15% effect of brittle very, very effectively. And I want to show you, if we activate these two abilities, we will turn off our normal auras. Now, you'll see that with the cold conversion here, as well as the effect of brittle, we're at 10%, we have 97% chance to crit. Going up to 11 puts us all the way at the top. This is with the cold tree, as well as the cold gear set, and the configuration of brittle at around 10 to 11%. This is easily obtainable very early on in the league. I tested this with like a level 67 character, I think is what it was, with just Gale Sight, Hrim Sorrow, a 5 link and some very basic gear, and I was getting 11 or 12 effective brittle, no problem whatsoever. That was even without having the +1 wands either. I just had like added lightning damage wands or something. So if you have the +1 wands, you will absolutely be able to hit a very high effectiveness of brittle. Now, later on, you will be moving into these cluster jewel trees, and what I want to try to explain to you is that very early without the cluster jewels, you will have more defensive layers than later on. The way that this build works is that you sacrifice your defensive layers for substantially more damage. The way that this build works is that you are essentially pulling back on defenses and scaling massive amounts of damage. Your goal will be to get these cold iron points. I know they will most likely be expensive early on, but these really are the items that you want to push for as quickly as you can. Tinker Skin will also be very useful for defenses, but you don't need this. You can get most everything on here elsewhere. And then on top of that, we will be obtaining a basic pair of trap gloves. These will allow us to put Exsanguinate in them and also stop using the Deerstalker boots. And then you can also see here that there is a 2 cluster tree. This is going to be significantly more expensive and difficult to get, but it is where the damage for the build will start to peak. So beyond all of this, make sure that you double check your configuration with the effect of brittle. Also, there are notes talking about the configuration, and do make sure to look through these notes for any information that you might need about the build. There's a ton of good information in here. And if you don't have your question answered from within these notes, make sure to join my Discord. I'm going to be making channels that'll have all of the league start information for each of the builds that I'm providing. So if you can't use Path of Building, if you're like a console player or something like that, this should give you an option to be able to see how to use the build. Now, talking about how we actually scale damage with this build, critical strike and critical strike multiplier are the kings of damage here, as well as some levels to gems and some physical damage. Seismic Trap is a bit of a weird ability because it does scale in alternative ways to just straight damage. Area of effect at some levels can cause you to overlap more often. This is not, in my testing, too great of a thing to try to force to scale. You get plenty of area of effect for traps from your Ascendancy as well as some of the points on the tree, and it isn't really super useful to be trying to push it any further than that. I've gone as far as trying like Awakened area of effect, and it doesn't seem like it makes them overlap too much more, so do keep that in mind. Another thing that we can scale with this build is increased duration. Seismic Trap, the wording is a little bit rough, but the way that it works is that when it says it releases 5 waves, those are the little circles that you see that are released by the trap. What Seismic Trap does is it pulses every so often, and it releases those 5 waves. It has a set rate that it's going to pulse at depending on your trap throwing speed, and the more that you increase the duration of the spell, the more overall pulses it can do per trap. Now you might think, why is this important? Well, Seismic Trap is a cooldown limited ability, so if the boss is standing still or the enemies are standing still and you can throw traps that last longer and do more pulses, they're going to do substantially more damage. However, in the end game, this isn't as useful because most of the bosses later on jump around like crazy, and it's really hard to get that many stacks of the Seismic really hitting the boss, so I don't feel that the increased duration is that useful later. Beyond that, we scale the build just like any other physical damage build or trap build that you would do: crit multi, physical damage, levels of the gem, spell damage, all that good stuff. And when we're talking about trying to stay alive in defensive layers, we did have a massive nerf to the main defensive layer that this build used previously, and that was going to be dodge. However, with the new additions and Grace supposedly being a very, very strong aura, we will be able to get quite a bit of evasion. The initial numbers look to be like 75% or more chance to evade once we get like Grace and everything updated in Path of Building, as well as easily obtaining 50% or more spell dodge, as well as some pretty high effective blind, which should increase the chance for us to evade pretty substantially. And then as well, the Saboteur did get a buff to its blind though, which means that we take 15% less damage from blinded enemies, and pretty much everything around us is going to be blinded. And that's not to mention the insane recovery layers that this build has. Even though we are spending life to cast our spells, we have a bunch of regeneration from our Ascendancy, a bunch of life recovery from things like flasks, as well as the Tinker Skin, which is going to keep us nice and healthy for pretty much the entirety of the game. Now, who should choose this build? I would personally say that this is one of the more powerful of my league starters, and it is kind of in the middle of like being very friendly for new players while still having a lot of room to scale. It's very good for bossing, pretty solid for clear, and on top of that, the items shouldn't be insanely expensive besides Cold Iron Point. I think that most of the gear isn't that difficult to acquire. So if you're wanting to really do some early boss farming, things like Cirrus for the gems, or like Elder, or maybe there is some Uber content that you really want to push, or maybe some of the new bosses that we're supposedly getting and things like that, this will be a great build for that. And that is pretty much going to be it for the video. Now, if you do have any questions or anything about any of my stuff, remember you can always join my Discord. Remember, the people there are not meant to help you. They will if they have time, but you know, you have to invest a little bit of time into this game to be good at it, so don't expect them to just be Google for you. But this build is most likely going to be my league starter unless something drastically changes. This is the build that I'm most likely going with, and I'm super excited for Scourge League. Now, if you're interested in seeing how this build does when we actually begin the league, make sure to check out my Twitch stream at twitch.tv/bigducks. I will be live for the actual start of the league. I'll most likely be playing this build, and you can see how the build functions at a early time in the league. So remember, boys, if you're enjoying all the content, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel for more content similar to this, and stay safe out there in Rayclast. And I'll see you guys in the next video.